Good evening. My name is Jessica O'Donnell and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Hugh Gallery this evening. Just first things first, to say that the emergency exits are the main entrance through which you came in, and also through Gallery 1, just in case of an emergency. I just want to say that this evening sold out in record time, and it was organised by the Hugh Lane as part of Dublin Gallery Weekend in tandem with our exhibition, The Ocean After Nature. So thank you so much for your enthusiasm, it's wonderful to see. The Ocean After Nature exhibition, curated by the Independent Curators International and currently on view here at the Hugh Lane, considers the ocean as a site reflecting the ecological, cultural, political and economic realities of a globalised world through the work of 20 artists and collectives, and includes the work of Drexciya. As Codwa Eshon has observed, more than 20 years after their first release, the sonic fictions produced by Drexciya, the Detroit-based electronic duo founded by James Stinson and Gerald Donald at the start of the 1990s, continues to enthrall contemporary cultural practitioners. As part of our programme of events exploring the themes arising from the ocean after nature, we are delighted to welcome Dopplereffekt, Gerald Donald and Tonan Lete to the Hugh Lane Gallery this evening. We are also delighted to welcome DJ Sharon Phelan, who we've just heard here, and this special evening will commence with a discussion led by Stephen Rennicks and Richard Brophy. Following this, we'll have a set by Sharon Phelan again, and also a wine reception in the entrance hall. And I'm delighted to say, for any of you who haven't seen the Ocean After Nature exhibition, there'll be an opportunity to see this during the interval as well on the first floor. So hopefully you'll have a chance to see that. I would really like to thank Dopplereffekt for being with us here this evening, and to our special guest speakers as well and performers, and to the gallery director and my colleagues for the support of this evening, to Simon Conway, Lillian Puteau, Niall O'Connor, Leslie McBride and Barbara O'Connell as well for all their valuable support and making the place look so beautiful as well. So thanks so very much for being with us here this evening, and without further ado, I have great pleasure in introducing Stephen Rennicks and Richard Brophy. Thank you.
So thanks to the Hugh Lane people, Lillian and Jessica, who we were contacting with, and invited us to do this. And so I don't know so my name is Stephen Rennicks, and 12 years ago I started doing a blog, in 2005, about, it was about like Drexciya, Dopplereffekt, ARPANET, all the sort of offshoot groups that they were involved with. And it was 2005, I was living in Carrick-on-Shannon, and I hadn't really done it. I did a little bit of journalism before, just for friends and stuff. And I moved up there and was living in an apartment with dial-up, and didn't know anybody. I just started a new job and I had a lot of spare time. And one of the things that I missed about living in Dublin was my friends Paul and Graham and a few other people, Ross and Paddy, we used to meet up in places like Grogan's and Stag's Head, and we would talk about Drexciya, we would talk about techno bands that we were into, electro, and I really missed that. And one of the things that so I brought up like my turntable, my records, and I brought up all of my Drexciya records and all the offshoot records. There was just those records were important, and I thought I'd start to figure things out about them, like figure out the Storm series, and just listen to them more closely. And the idea for doing the blog really came out of like Richard Brophy interviewed Drexciya in 2001, and there's about 14 long interviews that they did. There's a couple of Q&As and small things as well. So I thought, I was reading these interviews and I found them, I loved them. I loved what he was saying, it spoke to me. And I noticed by the time of 2005, he would have died in 2001, 2002. And then 3 years later, those websites like Techno Tourist, Future BPM, they were disappearing from the internet. So I thought the first thing I should do really, I printed them out in a very old-fashioned way. I wasn't happy just to read them off the screen. I was still thinking about printing them out and reading them at my leisure. So I had all these interviews, and I realized that they were disappearing. So I thought the first thing is definitely to archive. Even if I did nothing else, the archive was important. And I would have transcribed Richard's. I would have bought it at the time, clubbing.com. Anyway, and so that's how it started. It was really a way to archive stuff.
To archive stuff, yeah.
And later on, I just started to share things like new information about Dopplereffekt, and started to write about, from my own totally subjective viewpoint, what I thought, the Storm series was about, and just tried to do that kind of stuff. And that, you know, my art background is, you know, I do visual arts now, and I do all sorts of things. But it was just a fun project that I did, really, because I missed my friends, and I had a lot of time on my hands.
And it's obviously evolved to
and it's evolved now.
We're here.
Well, it's still going.
Still
I love doing it. I love finding out information, but just like any fan does, you know, I get a little bit of no inside information actually. People would tell me, oh, they just saw this on a website. You should, you know, share this now, and you know, because everything's happens so fast now. You can be, you know. So there's the Facebook page as well in the last 3 years, I think, and that's, you know, turned out to be very popular. I sort of resisted Facebook for a long time, and then I thought, well, you know, maybe
finally
I should start doing it. You know,
giving into the dark side.
Yeah. So that was my background. So Richard.
So my background is I'd always pretty much all my life been a record collector, and I'd always enjoyed buying records and all kinds of different types of music. And in the 90s, early 90s, I got into, in a big way, Detroit techno and electro. I'd been living in Germany for a few years, and I think initially I got into stuff like PCP tracks and The Mover, and there was that huge movement in Germany at the time with Sven Väth and The Omen, and it was very hard it was actually very hard to avoid it because it was everywhere. It was almost like pop music. But a spin-off from that then was, you know, you'd listen to Sven Väth or The Mover, and then you'd get into, you know, Derek May, or you'd buy I bought one of the original Network compilations. So I really got very, very interested and obsessed with Detroit and all its music. When I went back to Ireland then in the mid-90s, I started writing about electronic music. I did that for Hot Press. We started a column there. Into the 90s, worked for people like Jockey Slut, and then started in the late 90s with DJ Magazine, started writing their techno page, which I still do to this day. Part of the job was going around to loads of clubs and festivals. Saw most of the Detroit acts who I, you know, really admire. Unfortunately, Drexciya were one of the ones I never ever got to see. Saw Gerald Donald a few times, but never James Stinson with together as Drexciya, and that's because they never toured. But and then into the 90s as well, set up a webzine just because it was just an interesting way of grasping new technology and communicating with the world. And that's where the first. So there were 2 Stinson interviews. The first one was published in 1999, and it coincided with the release of the Neptune's Lair album. So that was Drexciya's second phase. We'll talk about that, but so that's the context to that. So the Neptune's Lair album was on Trésor, a German label, and then the second interview came in 2002, I think. Yeah, it was 2002. It was shortly before his death, and that was for the Transillusion album, Opening of the Cerebral Gates, and that was published in an Irish magazine called Clubbing.com, which is kind of a relatively short-lived venture on their part, but they were nonetheless open to publishing interviews by
and it was never online.
People like Stinson.
I have a copy of it in my bag, and you don't even have a hard copy anymore. I remember buying it probably in Easton's. I just saw it there and said, oh, wow. And it was a great issue as well, because they had D1 in it, like D1 Records, techno band group here in Dublin, and there was also a mix CD. So we were getting into the mix CD age, free CDs. And so do you want to talk more about your sort of background?
No, that's pretty much it. No, I've always been interested in Detroit music, and it's, you know, a fascinating city with many fascinating artists coming out of it. The most fascinating of whom probably are Drexciya.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think a lot of the techno artists coming out, I mean, the idea of concept is something that is very common. It's a common thread with almost all of them. Jeff Mills, particularly you are. So Drexciya were certainly in a tradition. I mean, otherwise, without without sort of a concept, I think people identify with the mythology. Like, I was talking to someone this earlier, and it feels like we're part of a secret society, a secret club. Like, we have bits of information that aren't, and it's quite a large, like, worldwide group of people. And, like, we've all, like, maybe met DJ Stingray, or we, met somebody, or we heard on a forum. And there's all this, I mean, that's what, when I was back in Dublin, like, we were talking about these things. My friend Graham had been in Club 69 in Paisley, in Scotland, and he, had seen UR play there in 96, I think, 99. And like he heard, you know, stuff about like Eamon Doyle of D1, had been in Detroit, met James Stinson. And, you know, so we all had little bits of information. So the first slide is really just showing how many tentacles, how many different, I mean, probably in more later years, and from 2000 onwards, they started to do the other people plays.
When they re-emerged, yeah.
When they re-emerged. So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I think, talking about Richard, is, like, nobody knew the names of either of them until after James died, you know, and then all of a sudden, like, it was on forums, it was on, you know, there was, people were writing memorial tributes to him, and it was strange that his name was suddenly out there. But up to that point, you know, in the first...
There was a huge mystique around them, wasn't there?
There was a huge mystique, and I don't think it took very much away. I think the mystique continued, it evolved, you know, into a different phase, you know.
Do you think it was part of the appeal, though, with Drexciya, that they were so unknown and that they didn't...
I think it was a combination, you know, personally, that was the mystique, the sort of, you know, the secret. The mythology was very rich, and the music, of course, was amazing. So I think it was a combination of things. It was a word-of-mouth thing. I mean, I didn't get into Drexciya until Neptune's Lair, so I missed that whole phase.
That first phase, yeah.
So I'm 45, you know, so I was like into tons of other bands, mostly guitar bands, all that kind of stuff. I like people like Aphex Twin, people at Warp Records. I was aware of all that, and then I started to go to Funk City.
That was the Decal Club.
Yeah, Decals Club, 98.
There.
Yeah, 98, 99, and like that was a beautiful experience because I was listening to sort of more club music, electro techno, and I didn't actually care who the musicians were. I was dancing, I was just into it. And then when the club closed down, sometime late in 99, I really missed it, and I started to track down the records and talk to Dennis and Alan from Decal, who DJ'd there, and other people that were aware of what the records were. And I remember trying to track down the Dopplereffekt record, Superior Race.
Yeah.
And I started to buy things like Aux 88 Presents Electro Boogie, because Alan O'Boyle told me, we played tons of music from this at the club, you should definitely pick that up.
Yeah.
And Drexciya were on there too, and I started to become aware of Drexciya late in the day, but like it was a second phase, which we'll get to. When did you come across?
So my introduction to Drexciya would have been around the time of Wave Jumper. So I think actually...
So 95.
Yeah. So I'd come back from Germany and I was kind of really obsessing in a major way about techno and electro. And I think actually I bought the Wave Jumper record in Tower Records at the time. They had like a really brilliant vinyl section.
Yeah.
So you were able to buy things on 430 West, you were able to buy things in UR, you were able to buy pretty much all the really decent Detroit techno labels.
I mean...
And so that was my kind of that would have been my kind of introduction to them and records around that time. I mean, at that time it was, I mean, obviously Wave Jumper is a nice record, but a lot of the records in that initial phase of Drexciya are quite hard. They're quite brutal.
Yeah, the early phase. Yeah.
You know, and you know, I think as well. Like later on, when I think during the second interview I did with Stinson, there was a sense that Detroit wasn't as important to him. I kind of got that undercurrent, but in the first phase, like definitely. I think they were very much of Detroit. You know, it's hard music from a hard city.
Yeah. You can say that.
There's a quote here from, I'm just going to read out this quote from Sherrod Ingram, who's DJ Stingray. And it was just an interview I did with Sherrod in 2012, so it's relatively recent. And he says, I knew Drexciya for years before that from Bayreuth, and I brought Donald down a few times to the club. And when he's talking about this bikers bar where he used to play, kind of a mixture of stuff. We used to play Drexciya there. There was one track in particular we used to play. Its name escapes me now, and the crowd used to do the hustle. It was a modified hustle, not a full 70s hustle. But you got to remember this was a motorcycle club. So that's kind of the background to you know, to Drexciya. You know, there was Balance of Terror. There was the Clarence G record. Yeah. Quite stark records. Yeah, I mean really, that in many ways.
Like so the Clarence G record. I mean,
and it got reissued recently as well.
Yeah, it got reissued. A lot of things happened this year. Because now it's not. I think it's a coincidence to do with the 15th anniversary of James Stinson, but a lot of things were reissued, like Other People Plays, Lab Rat, probably Clarence G, unless that was just late last year.
Yeah.
And so the early days, like phase one, like so. I mean, obviously, James. The story goes that James he did this himself. But I don't think that rapper. There's two tracks with hip hop, and then the other two are much more electro, so very hard electro. Yeah. And the two that are very hard electro are very much like precursors to Drexciya. Yeah. And the sort of hip hop stuff is a lot more. Obviously, it's completely different. So, but we don't know who that guy is. There's still some mysteries about maybe that may not be James, on the picture. It could be the rapper guy, it could be Clarence. So, there's a lot of, even though it's been reissued, Richard, nothing was still resolved about that,
No,
and it's nice in a way. The mysteries are there. So, I think a precursor to the whole mythology about Drexciya was the Life After Mutation, the Lamb release on Robert Hood's label. Do you remember this? You remember?
Not from back in the day. I mean, that
No.
one kind of predated my interest in
Yeah,
them
I
somewhat.
mean, this would have been very, small at the time. But I think the concept at that time was mutation through nuclear means. So they were thinking about, nuclear pollution. I think, going by I haven't got the slide with the other titles. It seemed like a whole other concept that they could have gone with. They could have gone with Drexciyans or whatever they were going to call it. So even at this stage, there's a heavy concept, potentially. That's my opinion, I could be wrong. And they could have gone down a whole other road of who are Drexciyans. They come from nuclear mutation and they live under the sea. I don't know.
Not too far from the original Jeff Mills project either, the Final Cut. So
Okay.
there was if you look back at Detroit, there was an industrial influence there as well.
Yeah.
There's like any city, it was open to a number of influences. If you read the Techno Rebels book by Dan Sicko, they were kind of emulating preppy parties and stuff too. So there's a whole range of kind of different influences.
Yeah, there was.
And that was one of them.
That was one.
And the Mills band was proper industrial band as well. So
and they toured in Europe. That's how they
toured in
hooked up, I think, with Trésor and all that back.
They did, because they played at Atonal, I think, which was one of. Which was, if memory serves me correct, Atonal back in the day was an industrial festival, and Final Cut were invited to play there, and I think that's where they met. That's where Mills originally met Dimitri Hegeman, who runs Trésor still. So anyway, that's just kind of
so
more
those
of an
connections were made. I mean, so in a way like this, you're talking. Drexciya were really second generation Detroit techno because obviously you've got late 80s. Kevin Saunderson, Derek May, Ewan Atkins, big fun, huge, big success in Europe, and and they were the second generation, but they were right hot on their heels. James and Gerald were incredibly young. They were 21, 22 at the very start. So we thought it was worth talking about how important. We're not going to get to tease out everything here, but we thought it was interesting. Because Drexciya, why are we talking about them now? How come we're still talking about the group, and still buying the records on reissue, and why are new fans still finding them? What was the mechanics of that? I think record labels were important to them. They didn't want to get tied down to one label. And I think some of the UR artists, some of the UR artists maybe did get bogged down on UR, and they only had releases on UR. And, they could have been, those guys, I remember talking to Suburban Night once, and he said he had loads of tracks, and they just there was a lot of people waiting to put out tracks on UR.
Yeah.
And so anyway, quite early on, ReFX Records contacted them after the first Deep Sea Dweller, and they said, okay, we put something out in Europe, and then it went to Warp, and then it went to, eventually. So, what do you think, Richard?
I think it's really funny. I think it's really funny that, not really funny, but it's quite brave on their part that they did that, because if you look at the experience a lot of the time with US artists in the techno and house scene, electro scene, releasing records at the time in Europe, it was a relatively negative one in that a lot of them got fleeced. There's a really funny story about Future 303, who did Acid Tracks. I interviewed them years ago, and they said that they released a few records on DJax, a Dutch label, and that they were being told that they were told that they weren't selling any records, and they actually went then to play live in Holland. It was a Dutch label, and they went into a local record store and said, do you have any, they didn't say who they were, they said, do you have any Future 303? And the person behind the counter said, yeah, we get them in, but they sell so fast we can't keep track of them. So there you go. There's one example maybe of many that people weren't getting their dues. So for Drexciya, or for a Detroit act who really never travelled outside of the States,
and
to
the first time
hook up is actually quite a brave thing to do.
Yeah, and they hooked up with a very young label. They even on the next UR release, they thanked Apex Twin. They weren't aware probably of the scene in the UK at the time. But I think because they work with so many different labels and distribution companies, and there was a lot of overlap, certainly, with some of the audience. But then you got very distinct audiences as well, like Trésor, but there would be an overlap, and Warp, they worked on all these different labels. Whether it was by design, I don't know, or good luck.
I think Trezor is interesting because, like, for years and years, and again, it goes back to the thing about Dimitri runs Trezor, meeting Mills and put them on
tour.
In that concert. But like even in, I think 91, 92, or memory fails me now, but very early 90s, Trezor put out a compilation called Detroit, Berlin, a Techno Alliance. So like the club had brought out, like Rub-a-Dub in Paisley, the club had brought over people like Mad Mike and Blake Baxter and all these people from Detroit from a very early stage. And it was a very very good trusting relationship there. So like kind of the flip almost to the future 303 story. This was a very good kind of a way of releasing records in Europe.
So I think word of mouth with all these different labels, it just sort of grew and grew, and the quality of the releases. It seemed to be, but yes, there was another route that other people took, and that was successful for them. But I suppose we don't know. We can only speculate why it didn't suit Drexciya to come up to Europe. They had jobs or whatever.
Well, Well, Stinson had a day job. He was not a day job. He did a night job. He was a trucker. He drove a truck. Yeah. And I'm not sure if he had a family or not, but
he seemed to have family.
But they never played. They never played live.
No.
Now the one thing was they were actually going to play live, but then he died. So,
well, they were going to play live originally at the Movement Festival in Detroit in 2001. So that was the big one, and they were going to play with Dopplereffekt and Ultradyne. It was like the dream
electro team.
Yeah. So, and that never came off because according to, just this year, I found this information on the Red Bull Music Academy article, like Mad Mike said that the police shut it down because they didn't have a permit for that venue.
Okay.
So, but it could have happened. But yeah, you were saying, Richard, to me earlier that they planned to start to play live.
So around the time of the Transillusion album, so that second interview part of that was that Drexciyas and ACT were going to come over to Europe. They were going to set up a production company, and I think you've got a slide there with there's a website that Stinson had done with a multitude of emails on it, email addresses where you could contact them. So around that time it was all about going from being an act that never communicated with anyone to being an act that just couldn't wait to communicate with people. It was kind of a strange one, but they never actually. The sad fact is they never made it to Europe. Yeah. Stinson died, and actually Stingray took Drexciya's place on that tour, the Warp Magic Bus tour.
Yeah, I was at that tour.
I was at that
at
too.
At the music centre.
Yeah,
in Dublin.
Yeah, and I think I can't remember now in the interview, but he referenced that was his first. That was Stingray's first ever gig outside of the US, and he was apparently bricking himself.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
But he obviously did a good job.
Yeah, he did. I remember. He played very fast.
He played Rob Hunt's Minus at 45.
Oh, did he? Yeah. Wow.
Like just weird stuff.
Yeah. And he's still essentially doing a similar type of set today.
More or less, yeah. It's high speed. It's high speed stuff.
It's his sound. But so I suppose when we're talking about phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, like phase 1 is really just the first sort of up to the Quest '97. Mostly releases on UR. There was one at Warp, and then there's a mysterious.
There's a hiatus, isn't there?
There is, for 2 years.
So the Quest was their way of saying goodbye at the time. So they did this interview in '96, '97 with Dave Mothersole in Music magazine, and at the time they'd said, "Look, this is it. It's over. The Quest is our." And then you're right. The Warp releases around that time. The Journey Home. I mean, that's.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to bring it to a conclusion. It seems like that.
It seems like that.
But then they obviously seem to have second thoughts, and they surprised everybody. Now, who was a fan already when they came back in '99.
So then they come back. They come back with Neptune's Lair in 1999, and I got a phone call in 1999 from the guy who was working for Trezor, doing the press for Trezor, and he was saying, "Look, do you want to interview James Stinson?" Right. And I'll bite your hand off. Of course, I want to interview James Stinson. But he said, we didn't say it was James Stinson. He said, do you want to interview a spokesperson it'll be a spokesperson from Drexciya, and I warn you that if you ask him a question that he doesn't like, he'll hang up. So he didn't. Luckily, he didn't hang up. But that was the start of the second phase. Yeah. So I mean, they went from, as I said, nobody knew their names in the first phase. Like they did these. There was a handful of these. Like I think there's two fanzine interviews. So I don't know if someone sent them a letter through UR or something, they might send you something back. Could have faxed it, maybe. They could have faxed it. Yeah. They could have faxed it back in the day. But look at the responses there. I mean, the responses are kind of just look. don't really know what you're talking about, and I don't really care. You know, when the time, like, the sense I got was that they didn't really fully, or sense anyway, didn't really fully kind of realise the impact maybe that they were having. It's almost kind of just disingenuous answers. Look, I mean, whatever.
Yeah. So it's probably just funny, like they just got something in the post and they just sort of scroll down. I mean, but yes, we might put some importance on it, but we can see it is what it is. It's just a quick. Probably never thought about it again,
Yeah.
But at that time, obviously, they weren't doing interviews. Although I think they talked to Dan Sicko early in that, because in this Techno the Rough Guide, don't leave home without it. There is quotes in that, because for a long time that was the only place where you could actually read. It brings up to 97, and it was the only place that you could read a kind of a potted history of Drexciya. In that book, they kind of are already talking about them in legendary terms.
Yeah.
And they haven't even done Neptune's Lair yet.
And they haven't done any of the Storm series either.
Yeah. So I think they warmed up gradually, and then the second phase, absolutely, Richard, they wanted to talk. They
wanted to talk, yeah.
Not in a big way.
Not in a huge way, no. Yeah. But I mean, I think it coincided musically as well with a much more, I wouldn't say mellow, because I could never use that word around Drexciya. But like if you look at Neptune's Lair, I mean, there's tracks on that like Andre and Sand Dunes that are much more mellow, much nicer. There still has the Drexciya steeliness to it.
Yeah. It became more of a listening album as well as a dance floor album.
It's an album you definitely listen to at home.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you kind of pursue that further, down a few albums, you've got the laptop one, don't you? The Other People Place.
Yeah, I mean, which
is a proper. Yeah. It's a lovely album. Yeah. And I think you called it in an interview recently a love album.
Yeah, I did. I just called it. Well, that was again my own interpretation. Like when I was doing the article, my articles late at night, at 2 or 3 in the morning, like in an apartment. When I was doing those original articles, I was. Listening to the album very closely, looking at all the artwork, and just trying to follow a story from the previous album. And anyway, it was just my own personal thing. But yeah, I felt that with that record, they were certainly, and we don't know if it was two or one person. It could have just been James on his own.
It could have been.
Again, they're the mysteries we may never get to the bottom of. It doesn't matter really.
No, it doesn't matter. I think what's important though is like during that second phase when they re-emerged, that there was other stuff happening in the wider world that kind of made their re-emergence more timely, maybe. Right. So there were things like, obviously the internet had become much more pervasive, much more freely available. There were internet forums, there were a lot more people talking about them. There was a lot more possibilities to disseminate information about them as an act. There was the start of online shopping. I mean, I think Discogs started in 2000, and I think maybe by 2002 you were able to buy records on it. And obviously there was other shops where you could buy records too. But at the same time, too, in the kind of wider world, their re-emergence coincided with kind of the collapse of things like super clubs, the end of kind of the big kind of the big clubby magazines. You even had on a kind of a smaller level too. A lot of the distributors in Europe were going bust. 2002 was a really bleak year for distributors in Europe.
Yeah, I think techno had peaked around 96, hadn't it?
It had really peaked, yeah. And then there was that infamous article in The Guardian where Alex Petridis said dance music is dead.
Wow.
So it was kind of like the death knell, and then these guys are around as well. So it's a funny one, really.
So then after they came back and they did really just Neptune's Lair.
Yeah.
And then they continued on, But I think when the Other People Place came out, nobody was expecting. That just appeared. Yeah. My memory of it was being in Big Brother Records and Killian telling me, you got to listen to this record. I don't think he particularly knew I was a Drexciya fan, but he might have. And I played it on vinyl there. So that came out of nowhere, and I was reading the artwork and thinking, maybe he must have tipped me off, So obviously in the press release it probably does say Hint, Drexciya, Detroit, or whatever. So, but it just sort of came out of nowhere. We didn't know there's going to be 7, 8 more records, 6 or 7 more records coming out within the space of kind of 2 years after that. And so that record appeared, and then it continued on, more records under different names, like as we were showing you at the very start, Elaborate Exile, Shifted Faces. Who knows, how many people made them? Probably 1, maybe 2. And then it's worth talking about, in the middle of the Storm series, all of a sudden, again, we hear James Stinson has died.
That's right.
I remember there was a club called New Romantic. It was like one of those clubs on Thomas Street. They were on Thomas Street at the time. You probably heard it. I was online in '96, so I wasn't really a member of any forums back then, but other people were, and somehow that's how I think the information got around so quickly. Do you think that was how people found out about him dying?
Yeah, it was definitely stuff like mailing lists.
Yeah,
and,
mailing lists and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that people had found out that he'd passed away.
And then, and suddenly we knew all this stuff about like his full name, how many children he had, his wife's name, all this stuff. And then that night, I remember there was a DJ called Alan Smith who was involved with D1, and spontaneously, it was either the day it happened or the day after. It was a small club, like 30 people, and he played an old Drexciya set.
Cool.
So in Dublin at the time, people. Every city had their Drexciya fans, and not this year. There was a brilliant. I was abroad at the time. There was like a Drexciya celebration here in Dublin. I'm sure people that were involved with that. These things just are spontaneous things. After Benny got in touch with me when the organisers, it gave me the idea. Maybe because it's the 15th anniversary, we should do this. I should float the idea, and maybe other people would like to do this. And it happened in Rome, Birmingham, Manchester, London, just small gatherings of people playing Drexciya and remembering Drexciya. But it was happening spontaneously in Dublin. Just that night, we didn't notice this guy, but we were a fan of his music. And
do you think there were any clues in the Storm series about what was about to happen?
When you look back, I think the life...
When you look back, there are probably, aren't there? There's running out of space, there's... he knew... Well, it's all speculation. We knew he had health problems with his heart. So maybe perhaps the Translusion album, the second Translusion album, Life is Fast Ending, Still Live, So things like that maybe were personal, maybe it wasn't, maybe he was... It's hard to know, because if you read his interviews closely, you can read things and it seems like, he expects to be around. He's got plans for the future. Yeah. So again, it's speculation on our part, for what it's worth, if you want to even think about it. Phase 2 ends very suddenly, and then the rest of the albums come out. And I remember, I'd found this website, and I don't know how I found it, because it's before social media, so I think somebody told me about it, and I found this website that he built himself. So, he was aware of the power of media, of the internet that was coming. And this is what would happen. I think it's just like a free page on GeoCities, which doesn't exist anymore, like a Yahoo thing. And it's long gone, but I think it's on the Wayback Machine, if you look for it. But anyway, so he was certainly aware of the future was going to be people connected on the internet. Yeah. And that really, things, in my opinion, after the Storm series, the rest of those albums were released, it went a bit quiet. And the last one came out in 2003, the last reissue, the last Labra XL came out in 2003, I think. And then it kind of went a bit quiet. And UR did do a kind of a tribute, the Aquanauts, and that didn't kind of go anywhere. So there was 2 releases, and then that's gone as well. And I think James Stinson's brother was involved with that project. That's what they said. Okay. And then you're into the third phase, which not everybody gets this. They're not forgotten about. It starts new fans. I don't think you can. I think they're the kind of act you can never really forget about, because I think we were talking about this earlier, and I think maybe this is an oversimplification of things, but I think for me, if you talk about electro, you talk about Kraftwerk and then Drexciya. Okay. And I just don't think that there is any, there's no way you could forget about them. I think what's interesting is maybe people coming up who've discovered them, and that that there's been like you said earlier, there's been a whole kind of reissue of the Storm albums, and then there was the Clone series, the Journey to the Deep Sea Dweller.
Yeah, that was huge, and that was just concentrating on the first 7 years.
It was the first tranche of music, and there was some unreleased material as well.
There was some unreleased.
A few bits of unreleased material, but it's really amazing that that there's obviously still so revered.
Yeah, but it was nice that it coincided with the birth of, people can say that 94 was the beginning of, but most people weren't online until about 99, 2000. Yeah. And it really coincided. So people were talking about them. YouTube came along a few years later. Yeah. You can watch their music. It I mean, when I heard about them, it was through word of mouth. People like Graham in Spin Dizzy, like knowing that I was a fan and saying, "You got to hear this record. It's one of the New Storm records, you know." And so it was word of mouth. But like with the internet, there is a kind of nice word of mouth thing as well, even though it's more virtual. So people started to share things, and Drexciya, like here's the YouTube link or whatever. And then I'm sure free downloading. I'm sure that they were probably victims of free downloading as well. But it probably didn't do them any harm. Like, it just spread the word.
Probably spread the word.
Probably spread the word
about their music.
It only hurt Metallica. But
good.
So that was really the phase 3, and now it's funny. It's getting bigger and bigger because their influence. I mean, 10 years ago there was an artist called Ellen Gallagher who had a show here in the Hugh Lane, and she had a show called Choral Cities. I remember coming up to have a look at it. She was one of the first artists that I was aware of, that was visual artist, that was taking an interest in the mythology of Drexciya. And we don't have a slide of her work, but it was nice. It's nice to be back here in the Hugh Lane, literally 10 years later, talking about Drexciya, because upstairs in the back galleries there was a lovely exhibition of her work. And Ellen Gallagher is, a well-recognised, quite large artist. Lives between New York and Rotterdam. And so she was interested in the mythology, and she was inspired to do paintings based on that. And since then, in this exhibition, you've got the Otolith group. You've got quite a few artists that have used their visual. So that happened, obviously, in phase 3. The mythology started to become influential, not just the music.
What do you make about the whole mythology around Drexciya? Like the whole thing about the fishmen and the pregnant slaves and...
Well, I think
the underwater civilization.
Well, it's a beautiful mythology, and it's spoken to so many people. I think it's given people a key to, because when I'd be talking to people back in the day, again, it was word of mouth. How do you tell someone about Drexciya? You tell them about the story, about the mythology. That this is a band in Detroit, and they have created this whole fictional world, most obviously on Neptune's Lair. And sometimes they would have the information that on the Quest sleeve notes, it was explained. See, people have, everybody has questions, and it's a combination of underground resistance, the unknown writer, probably James himself, having a conversation and talking about, well, on the artwork of the Quest, what do we need to put some stuff in there, and do we want to sort of expand the mythology? Do you want to, so I don't know who wrote about the pregnant African slaves. Comes from 1997. It's signed by the unknown writer.
Do we need to explain that though? I just wonder.
Yeah, we can explain that.
Do you want to?
No, you can say it.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, there is the story about Drexciya that when they talk about where they came from.
Yeah.
That their forefathers are
the offspring.
They're the offspring of pregnant slaves who were thrown overboard of ships.
Yeah, and the Otolith group, who has a film here, Hydra Decapita, was shown I think twice during the run of this exhibition. They really, their film really looks at that, and there was an historical. Obviously, this happened when people were being transported from Africa to America and other countries around the world for slavery. In the 1600s and 1700s, people would be slaves were insured, so if they lost slaves, they would still get paid. So there was quite a famous episode called the Zong Massacre. It was a British slave ship, and 173 slaves were thrown overboard because water was getting short. So, and they were reimbursed. There was a court case that was controversial at the time. It also inspired Turner to do a painting about this subject. So it was a very real thing, and it happened, so the slaves were insured. They could just dump them as disruptive cargo. And so if they got sick, or they might infect the rest of the slaves. They're expendable. And, so people would be thrown over. And obviously, underground resistance. I'm sure James Stinson was interested in the roots of African Americans, how they ended up there, slavery, and they chose to make that central in a mythology that they connected to the Drexciya, where they came from. So it was again very poetic. It's continuing to speak to a lot of people.
I think one of the great things about Drexciya is you can just on so many levels. you can appreciate them. You know, if it's just, you know, if you're just listening to their music, you can appreciate
Oh,
that.
yeah.
You can appreciate their visual identity. You can appreciate the myth making, and just, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's very rich. It's very,
really, really rich. Yeah, I mean, there's so much going on.
Yeah.
There's so much to even. I think it's very thought-provoking music as well, and you know, even though it is instrumental, you know, it just has so much. It's so visual. It's very, very inspiring.
And I think like James was very open to visual artists getting involved, because Abdul Haq did the artwork for Declan's Lair. I mean, it's a collaboration.
Yeah.
So James met up with him, and you know, he wants him to do everything: the front cover, inside cover, and you know, these are the finished pieces that he came up with. And also with like this is the insert to the Quest.
Yeah.
So I mean, obviously, in the same way that they were happy to collaborate with visual artists in Detroit, in the way they looked, you know, the way they presented their covers, they also were happy to collaborate with people like the Unknown Writer, Mad Mike, because they're putting the artwork together for the Quest. And Drexciya don't exist anymore, supposedly, in this period. So, and at the end it says. Like, it's very hard to read that, impossible. It's just that's the way it's actually yellow text on the original. But like they say at the very end, the end of one thing, the beginning of another. But it's all question marks. Were Drexciyans the offspring of pregnant African slaves?
We don't know.
So
it's open to interpretation.
They're saying like this is a possibility.
I think a lot of this with Drexciya is just, look, you know, draw your own conclusions. You know, it's totally open to interpretation. I think that's one of the nice things about it.
Yeah, I mean,
really needs to kind of
and Frankie Fultz, which is another artist that you are worked with.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, there's a quote. He says, you know, I listened to the music and it made me think of. I mean, that's become the iconic, you know, Drexciya on a million bootleg T-shirts and the clone reissue, the wave jumper logo. Like, this was just out of his own imagination. That you know, he was given the freedom just to, he listened to the music and what you hear, and he started to really define. So they were bringing in other people into it to make the mythology more rich. It wasn't just coming from them. So that was fantastic as well. And I think that's part of it's why it's so rich. Like, it's not just one or two persons' vision. It's a couple of people. It's collaborative. And it's still growing, you know. Phase 3, we're in it. We're going to be.
I suppose we're kind of in phase 3 at the moment, eternally, aren't we?
Yeah, we're in it eternally. It's only going to be
locked on to phase 3 forever.
I don't know what phase 4.
But it's just interesting to think now. Like, you know, I mean, obviously it's 15 years since James Stinson died. We were just talking earlier about this. That, like, if you want to call it techno music, it's become hugely popular. You know, it's become almost kind of the mainstream of dance music, and then a spin-off of that is electro. Okay. It's become more and more popular. You look at things like Helena Hauff has got a show on BBC Radio 1, which probably, like, nowadays isn't as much as what it was 20 years ago, but it still is quite a weighty, you know, development, or it's quite a weighty thing to say that someone like that is, and she plays Drexciya Records on Radio 1.
She's a completely, like, someone from a totally different generation, you know.
Like, she's in her late 20s and she's playing this music. There's a really interesting Facebook post a few months ago from Sharon Ingram, where he said that he went to a club in Berlin, or he was playing at a club in Berlin, and there were all these people who were there in their younger people in their mid-20s, and whoever was playing like Ox 88 records, Drexciya records, UR records, and he couldn't get over the fact that all these kids are 20 years younger, totally and utterly into it, which is brilliant.
I remember being a huge Ox 88 fan before I was Drexciya fan.
Yeah.
You know, and in a funny way, Ox 88, you know, I've sort of lost touch with what people, you know, but like they deserve, like they were incredible, but yet they didn't have the mythology.
Mythology.
You know, and have they had the reissues? Do you think, Richard? Like,
I don't think so. Well, I think actually Direct Beat are putting out reissues. Yeah. But I just don't think that they.
But it's not happening on the scale, perhaps.
No.
Like it should be. Yeah. There's great like a whole generation of people don't know Ox 88. Yeah. They came out of Detroit. And they were Keith Tucker, Tommy Hamilton. And they're probably both still making music. But, you know, but that's what we were talking about earlier. Like how, for some reason, Drexciya were one of those bands.
It was a combination of things, I think. You know, it was just a combination of the imagery, the myth-making, the music. But also, too, the fact that I think that Drexciya just sound totally different to anyone else.
I mean, it's like they talk about Joy Division being future-proofed by Martin Hannett. Yeah. Even though some of the Drexciya productions might sound a bit primitive, for some reason, they do sound contemporary.
I think it's more that they maybe sound timeless, that they can just never be, that would just be my opinion.
Yeah, well, because they'll still sound, it's more of a timeless thing.
Like if we're sitting here in 20 years' time, like, and we'll be listening to, we're talking about the laptop cafe.
I think
it's still going to sound, I believe it'll still sound amazing.
I think so, I agree.
I think the issue now is, the issue nowadays is, where does it go from here?
Okay.
Where like the legacy is there, we're in phase 3. Is there a new Drexciya? I don't think there is. Can there be anyone on that level who can?
I'd hate to say that it couldn't happen again, but
I'd love to believe that it could.
Yeah. Well, again, like, I mean, I don't know, Richard, in a way, what's going to happen. It'd be wonderful. Potentially, there could be. I think there's always something interesting that's going to happen, and I think, look, I mean, you're talking about, I can't give you a good answer, Richard, on that one.
Get back to me, honest.
Yeah. We'll wait and see. And you have to remember things like the Electroids, like this came out in '95. Deserves another reissue, and these are records that still sound incredible.
One point to make about Drexciya, and just on that point about can it happen again? I think one of the barriers nowadays, actually, and I think we talked about this before the talk began, is social media.
Yeah.
And the fact that nowadays everything is interconnected and actually hyper-connected.
Yeah.
And that you can't, one can't stay, I mean, when Drexciya started off, they're an act from a city, and it's quite a very specific sound. Yeah. And they weren't connected in the sense that, you or I couldn't really kind of sit in our bedroom in Dublin and kind of get their records immediately. Yeah. There wasn't an immediacy. Yeah. And that actually the fact that they were disconnected allowed them to flourish as an act. Yeah. And I just wonder nowadays, what you'd probably need to do is go off grid almost.
Yeah, you'd really need to.
I mean, go to Carrick and Shannon or something like that.
Yeah. You need to just. I mean, Boards of Canada to some degree went genuinely off grid. Yeah. And been very successful. They don't really do interviews particularly.
Yeah. Good.
And so there's a big mystery. So maybe someone like Boards of Canada is one of those.
Is one of those acts. But when I hear
they're far. I mean, their breadth of production. It's narrow. It's amazing what they do. But they might someone like Burial. I was thinking about. I suppose this goes back to what we're talking about. He uses SoundForge. Like, see, Drexciya were using quite primitive things. Like, it was hardware. Yeah. And I think they pushed the equipment. You see, one of the quotes from James Stinson, he's talking about how with the way technology has grown, even in 2000, 2001, it was easy to make a record. You'll just sound like everybody else, but anyone can make a record now if they have the technology and they know, like software, And someone like, but they were using primitive enough technology, and they were doing it live. See, that's what a lot of people, probably do all know, but they were doing it live in the studio. Yeah. They weren't going back, there might have been a couple of versions of the same track, but they'd start again, and they'd do it again. And someone like Burial, say, today is using just SoundForge, supposedly, and he's just layering on his loops or his textures. Yeah. But he's getting a lot out of the minimal approach, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, the only person I can think of nowadays who completely goes his own way and is completely almost impervious to anything else going around him is someone like Trax, who runs Nation. I think he's completely out there in every sense. Yeah. And I think that probably speaks to why but he's more of a DJ. He's like his productions. I'm not really sure about. But I just think it's interesting to think. Is there anyone nowadays? If you want to talk about electro, is there anyone actually doing it to that level of that unique level? Maybe the Drexciya are. But I hear loads. I hear loads of new electro records all the time. They're all really well produced and they all sound great. But there is that just in the end that.
I think one of the interesting things about the influence of Drexciya's music is that it's very hard to say that there's somebody, I can't think of anybody that really sounds like them, but yet they're name dropped a lot, and there have been lots of tributes, there's lots of song titles that reference Drexciya.
I know.
I mean, it's just all respectful, and they're obviously a fan. But there's actually, because for whatever reason, the way they made the music, probably because it was kind of in a primitive live way. Yeah. There's not many people who are approaching music in that way for whatever reason that is.
I'll just read you a quote from Stingray from again, it was from 2012. people are adulterating the word electro. Electro has become the trash bin of genres. Just throw anything into it. I don't want to see people who make non-4/4 music just being called electro. I think it's pretty fair. You know, it's without being too negative. Obviously, it's a fair enough quote. You know,
I think
to
so.
say.
Yeah.
But I think, and that just brings us on to this thing about Drexciya's thing about experiments must keep on going.
Yeah. I mean, they weren't afraid of, just listen to the music, even something like the Translusions Life album.
Yeah.
They were experimenting right up to the end. I mean, they didn't call their music techno, electro.
No.
They were aware that people were going to put a label on it. And I don't think it bothered them greatly. There's a quote there where they were just saying they know that people are going to label it, but as far as they're concerned, it doesn't have a label, a genre label.
Yeah, that's right.
And obviously the other thing about living in Detroit, they said that was just accident. It was a coincidence.
That's right. Later on, they seem to like just go back to what we were saying earlier about them being, their music being played in biker bars and them being, Gerald Donald's meeting Stingray in by right and just all that kind of stuff, very Detroit focused. But you're right. Later on, they kind of seem to. Not that they kind of took a step back, but
maybe
just...
they always felt like that. But those interviews, they weren't the interviews in the early days.
Yeah.
And then they started to become quite verbal about. James became quite he was making a big point. He said it in a number of interviews that he didn't want to. He said Drexciya, it's imaginary place. Mm-hmm. It's not about it's in their head. They're in their heads, and he talked about them going very deep with deep concepts.
That's right.
And that's where things like people living on water. I mean, if you looked at the Storm series, what does that mean? It's much more inner, it could be, much more finding your true self, perhaps.
Yeah.
Meditative. It's about going inside. That's just my opinion. So there's quotes that back that up. So when I was doing those articles about each Storm series, each Storm record and going along, I was trying to back it up with quotes from people like yourself. And they shut themselves down. And in your interview, Richard, they mentioned that to you.
That
they didn't listen to other people's music.
They didn't listen to anyone's music. Yeah, that was a really weird thing.
Yeah.
Because, invariably, if you're interviewing someone,
right.
You would ask, is there any other musician, is there any other artist, or is there anyone else you're influenced by? And the answer on both occasions was no. When we go and do our music, that's it. It's kind of into the studio, and that's it.
Yeah.
But it's interesting actually what you said there about them being inner, that idea, because obviously a lot of their concepts are around underwater.
Yeah.
But this idea about them retreating into their inner selves or the inner space, which actually is, in a funny way, without kind of getting sidetracked too much, is somewhat of a Detroit concept. Because if you look at Suburban Nights records, he to me is one of the great kind of unsung heroes really of Detroit techno.
And he needs we should be reissuing his music as well. And absolutely
have a Suburban Nice. I don't know, but
his fans,
all his fans. But his records are it is a lot of those records are about the inner self. They're about the inner space. They're hugely claustrophobic,
echolocation,
paranoid records, to the nth degree. If you look at By Night, there's a stealth bomber on it. It really is very kind of inner, inside here in my brain kind of thing.
It's worth pointing out that in the quotes from James, he said that the music came first and then the concept. So they do the music live in the studio, wherever it took them. And not everything, obviously, was going to be picked. And then they'd listen to the music, and then they'd come up with a concept. So then they'd go deep. And they'd start to figure things out, what it meant, how it fitted into the concept, or would it be a whole other album? Did it belong? And they kept experimenting, as we were saying, as well.
It sounds like, I never really found that out, but it sounds like the music was recorded pretty much live in one take.
That's what they say.
Yeah, there was no kind of, we better go and edit this, or we better go and take this bit out.
No, it doesn't seem like they definitely talk about, working live, all the time, consistently in the quotes that they mentioned.
Yeah. So,
I mean, I suppose I don't know what time it is, but it feels like we've been going on for a long time here. But,
yeah, we have.
So tell us so basically, that's the interview that Richard did. So then, you're coming to the end point here. I mean, this is still phase 2, though. But, so things like, one of the most, anyway, everybody knows the story. I mean, right at the end, they were doing incredible things that touched people, like this idea of naming a star after Drexciya. It's a very simple idea. It's like something like an artist or somebody would do, and they were artists, And that is a real thing. You can go to the Star Registry, and actually I've linked it on the website before, and So again, like, that's the sort of thing, like, they had this idea, they went with it, and the music was incredible, and...
Definitely the second interview I did with Stinson, like, they were really into the idea of communicating with the outside world. They were really into the idea of reaching out. He was also very much of the mind that the music that they'd made in the first phase had been very much, as he says themselves, for the hardcore DJs.
Okay.
But there's a quote here. He basically said, "Look, you need to enjoy your life. The world has become, and this is in 2002, has become a much darker place, and we want to entertain." So he said that his health problems too had given him a huge new perspective on his life, and that's maybe. He also talked about music's healing powers. So it was very much a change.
Yeah, well, and he also talked about fun, like the whole thing about mystery, like the mystery they put out there.
Yeah.
He said this is fun.
Yeah.
It's going to be fun for the listener to figure this stuff out.
Yeah.
So it was about enjoying life. It really was about fun, and they loved the mystery. Yeah. And the mystery has kept them alive, and the music has kept them alive. And I think, but they're not the only ones that have done it. But for some reason, they spoke to people, and we're talking about them, and it was a perfect blend, and just enough information, and it's survived, and it's evolving, like, as people find out more information. There's always going to be mystery there, and everybody can just take people are going to, it's going to mean whatever it is to each person. Everybody has a different...
It's totally subjective, I think.
Totally, and it's beautifully designed like that, and so maybe we could leave it at that rambling way.
That's kind of nice. Rambling,
because kind of way. I think, it's a conversation that
just keeps
everybody
going.
here has had this conversation probably. Why do they like this band so much, or what is about them? And it does end up like, well, they're amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard and Stephen, for your talk. Does anybody have any questions or any talk? If not, just to say, our Ocean After Nature exhibition, which is brought to the gallery by Michael Dempsey and Logan Sisley, is on view upstairs, and please also enjoy a glass of wine as well. So, okay, thank you.